Hi, I'm Noel Oljave. In this video I'm going to be doing an in-depth critique of Dragon Age Inquisition, the third and by far largest of the Dragon Age titles. I'm going to be doing a really detailed look at the game, so there's going to be major spoilers. If you haven't played the game yet, take care. I ruin a lot of stuff, including the ending. But I get to talk about those things, and a lot of video reviews so far don't. So, if you don't mind the spoilers, keep going. When I first started reading about Inquisition way before it was released, it looked like it was going to deliver the best of two worlds. The incredible storytelling and character building that characterize a Bioware game, and the player-driven open-world exploration that has long been the domain of Bethesda RPGs. I did my Skyrim vs. Dragon Age retrospective video just to explore that dynamic while I was waiting for Inquisition to finally arrive. After a 90-hour comprehensive playthrough of Inquisition, I have to admit that I was wrong. I wasn't wrong to be excited. Inquisition is one of the most consistently beautiful games I've ever played from a visual perspective, and its realization of the world of Dragon Age makes it come to life in ways it never really has before. What I was wrong about is how I expected it to blend open-world mechanics with Bioware storytelling. It does not borrow heavily from Skyrim. It borrows instead from the limited experience Bioware already has making open-world RPGs. Inquisition is, in its blood, a single-player MMO that owes many of its design decisions to the Old Republic, Bioware's big-ticket Star Wars MMO that never really took off. I stopped playing the Old Republic a couple months after it launched and had more or less forgotten it, mostly because of how incompletely the role-playing elements meshed with the trivial, endless grinds of the MMO elements. Inquisition improves on a lot of the Old Republic's problems, but it also carries over a lot of those problems. Inquisition is a difficult game to critique because it is so many things at once, because it is perhaps the most ambitious Bioware title to date, and absolutely the most gorgeous, even where the pursuit of that ambition and beauty causes the game to fall flatly on its face. Inquisition is the biggest single-player game Bioware ever released, bigger by actual in-game miles than I ever expected it to be. Thoroughly exploring the game, knocking out all the quests you can find, can easily surpass 100 hours of gameplay. It's probably got the best content for dollars ratio out of all the games released last year. It is overwhelmingly huge, spanning 2 kingdoms and little over a dozen gigantic regions, from deserts to rain-swept coastlines to lush forests of several varieties. You control not just the destiny of you and your adventuring party, but control a sprawling political and military organization that can shift the face of the world as the game progresses. It's the world of Thetis, writ large in a way the series never has, indeed in a way that's more technically impressive than anything I've ever seen from Bioware. I remember the first time I saw grass waving in the wind in Neverwinter Nights when the first one came out, and I thought my character looked absolutely amazing, standing there in full 3D, real 3D, with grass that wasn't just painted into the texture. I felt like I was looking at a small piece of the future, a step on the way to a game where what can be displayed on the screen is as detailed as what I see in my imagination when I read the text boxes and written descriptions that all older RPGs rely on. Neverwinter Nights the First, graphically and otherwise, has aged poorly, but it's an important step between the isometric AD&D adventures of Baldur's Gate and Dragon Age. Dragon Age Origins felt like a new Neverwinter Nights, the same spirit without the Dungeons & Dragons licensing fees. Now, with Inquisition, I think it's clear that Bioware has finally and fully moved on from the tabletop-inspired design choices of previous games. Sure, it uses the 4-person party, it asks you if you would like to gather your party and venture forth, but Inquisition is a modern title. It draws from modern game design more than it does anything in Bioware's back catalog. From its cinematic plot and scene direction to its compulsive, sprawling quest structures, Inquisition is relentlessly contemporary, and I can't figure out if I mean that as compliment or criticism or both. What I wanted from Inquisition, what the fans asked for, was an epic role-playing experience that was as wide open as Dragon Age 2 was closed off, with a full realization of its world and its peoples. I got that. I got 100 hours of it. I spent 20 of those hours bending over to pick up Elfroot. The real difficulty the designers faced with Inquisition was organization. The players want a huge world, hugest possible. They want to do things within the world in a chaotic, free-form way. For Skyrim, the solution was to reduce quest complexity and, for the most part, to eliminate quest consequence. Everything in Skyrim is about the player character, where Dragon Age is supposed to be about the whole party. The kind of dynamic quests with multiple solutions that Bioware is known for are time-consuming and complicated to put into the game. To jam literally hundreds of quests in, as per the expectations people had for Inquisition and the promises the developers made, would require at least some of these quests to be simplified. Unfortunately, some became most somewhere in the development process. In Skyrim, triviality worked well because everything was more or less along the same continuum of campy, high-fantasy fun across a giant continuous landscape. Inquisition is much more disjointed, consisting of vast wilderness zones like desert canyons in the afternoon sun in one zone and snowy mountain castles in another, with differing level requirements.
Skyrim was a simulation. The day changed as time passed, citizens had routines, life went on around you. Everything in Inquisition is completely static outside of the questing. Time doesn't pass, NPCs wait patiently outside their huts for you to return. In exchange for the kind of fidelity to the rhythms of daily life that Skyrim had, in Inquisition you get much more variety. Oblivion had a lot of different sorts of landscape, but they blended poorly, and the low draw distance for grass and trees, huge for the time, of course, I mean, don't get me wrong about Oblivion, made it seem like a patchwork quilt of a kingdom. Inquisition's regions give you all of these different flavors of Thedas, centering themselves around more of a mood and a theme than any kind of narrative event. And they are beautiful. Perhaps the game engine that powers Skyrim is more powerful than the one that powers Inquisition, but the world of Inquisition is flat out the most lush and verdant series of landscapes I've ever seen in a game. Skyrim's world is incredible, sure, but the things that make it more dynamic, the greater openness of its maps, the day-night cycle, also mean that sometimes, for the best views, for the best angles, you have to catch things from the right positions at the right moment. Inquisition has a much more painterly approach, making angles of approach for players when they're coming up on landmarks more uniform, making sure that players see things from the perspectives and with the quality of light that have the greatest impact. Since I have boring taste in art, landscapes are my favorite subgenre of painting, and Inquisition's vistas continually reminded me of artists like Thomas Cole and Albert Bierstadt, who used larger-than-life light and shadow to make the everyday seem mythic, while still being grounded in really realistic detail. I have no idea if BioWare's art team are fans of the Hudson River School of landscape design, but some areas seem ripped right from that legacy. The Storm Coast in particular is a majestic slice of landscape design, the way the waves swell and crash, the scope of the coast littered with ruins. 3D graphics have come so far since the days of Neverwinter Nights that I would say that this is one of the first AAA games that I would consider art based solely on its spectacular visual composition. It's apparent that this massive, exquisitely detailed world was priority number one with the game, and with good reason. Dragon Age 2 was so ridiculously claustrophobic and repetitive that it made many longtime fans almost swear off of the franchise entirely. So the challenge then becomes, once you have this massive, aesthetically segmented world all laid out, figuring out what the player is supposed to do with it. What I expected was regions like the Wending Wood from Origins Awakening expansion, a medium to large area with a couple collection quests, a couple side quests, and a main quest, all story-driven and tying together. What I got was both more and less than the areas from Awakening. There are dozens upon dozens of quests for most of these areas in Inquisition, but precious little of that content involves choice or story, and sweeping through a region start to finish can mean putting the game's actual plot on hold for almost a dozen hours while you solve quests whose solution is almost always kill things or pick things up off the ground. This is where the Old Republic's design influence comes into play. The actual experience of these vast regions is much less about the plot and the story as it is about leveling up your character, finding junk to sell, and collecting crafting materials. Trivial things. BioWare created their most visually spectacular world ever, and decided that the best way to compel the player to explore it was busywork. It's difficult to puzzle out why they went this direction with the design. Part of it, I'm sure, is that the trivial is also the affordable. To fulfill the promise of hundreds of quests, some corners are going to be cut. As I've said, though, it wasn't just some corners. In the end, it was most. Side questing is completely unlike previous Dragon Age titles. It feels kind of pointless and divorced from the plot. A lot of side questing in Dragon Age 2 felt that way, since it was the same maps over and over again, with the same waves of enemies over and over again. But the end of most of the side quests in Dragon Age 2 had, on average, a lot more dialogue and a lot more choice, even if it was just an attitude choice and not a plot-changing one. Most quests in Inquisition autocomplete when done, and only serve to get the player items, crafting materials, and experience. This part of Inquisition, the bulk of the gameplay, treats your player character like an MMO does, as a faceless series of continually growing statistics. In an MMO, however, the statistics really mean something. Players compete with one another, difficulties the same for all players, necessitating these gear-driven stat increases to maintain competitiveness. In a single-player game, with an adjustable difficulty, it is completely unreasonable to expect the pursuit of these numbers-related goals to hold a player's interest to what probably amounted to 50 hours of my 90-hour playthrough. On higher difficulties, where you have to be tactical and statistics really do matter, boosting these numbers to the point where you aren't constantly reloading takes an incredible amount of time, to the point where you dread the 100-plus blood lotus you need to collect to upgrade the grenades you want, alongside the 200-plus elf root you'll need for potions and stronghold upgrades, much more than you will ever dread the game's actual villain. Players with the most interest in the highly tactical aspects of gameplay, particularly gamers who come from a tabletop-influenced perspective, are probably the players most likely to object to the busy work feel of most of these side quests. You're the leader of a world-changing political power. Why have you spent the last 45 minutes of gameplay trying to herd a fancy-schmancy holla across a giant rocky field? Shouldn't you be able to delegate some of this stuff? Of course, delegating that stuff is one of the game's other major aspects, using your advisors and the war table to plan the Inquisition's expansion. It was incredibly frustrating for me that so many of the quest setups and climaxes present in the war table portion of the game were so good. Find Corypheus' true name when he was still a human magister, catch a murderer who is imitating crimes in Varric's novels, move the Grey Wardens into battle against a corrupted noble. While the advisors were off doing these quests, which take actual human time to complete, some over 24 hours of actual human time, I was closing Fade Rift after Fade Rift after Fade Rift, completing quests so vague I didn't fully appreciate why I was doing them some of the time, picking up Elfroot and capping it off with a Druffalo roundup. Then, I come back, and my advisors tell me about assassination attempts in the Grand Cathedral and sneaking into ancient Tevinter archives, and it is clear to me that my advisors are having a way better time and getting a lot more done than I am. Honestly, sincerely, what the fuck is with that? So many of these setups and conclusions, whose ending does change on who you send to complete the operation, are classic Dragon Age. They tie directly into the plot and they expand the lore. Why couldn't they have put these quests into the environment and left this bullshit crafting collection to the war room? There are collection operations, sure, but this is the inverse of the game world. There's so much interesting stuff to do on the war table, and your advisors can only do so much of it at a time, that you delegate the least interesting tasks to who's ever left over after your advisors are assigned. That's you, the Inquisitor. I think this dynamic is best illustrated with the temple in the Hissing Wastes region. As you search this massive nighttime desert, you find tombs of a clan of dwarves living in a city on the surface, unheard of among the ancient dwarves. Slowly, you piece together a key for the final tomb of the dwarven paragon who founded the city and fight one of the game's incredibly rendered and massively proportioned dragons in a 10-minute plus boss fight to open it. In Dragon Age Origins, or even Dragon Age 2 for the most part, you'd find some kind of incredible plot secret within. Here, there's only another chest. Everything you did in that region is only for this chest. They haven't rewarded my curiosity, they rewarded my character sheet. That's not why I play Dragon Age. Meanwhile, at the war table, Leliana assists in the hilarious disruption of an Orlesian party for the Red Jenny organization. It sounds like a great time, but I was too busy trying to find enough Stormheart to craft a better axe to attend the party personally. The war table really is an excellent addition to the game, though, and it shapes the game in some really nuanced ways, both in terms of moving the plot forward and pacing how the player interacts with the game as a whole. While previous BioWare titles are fantastic at showing the arc of your hero and their adventuring party growing from relative unknowns to movers and shakers of the first degree, BioWare's never really tried it with a whole organization before, but Inquisition absolutely nails it. It's another one of their absolutely primary design focuses, showing how one hand guides the many over time as your influence expands. The way Inquisition troops will occupy a region's chokeholds and strongholds as you complete quests in the region goes hand in hand with the war room activities, tangible results bolstered by clever writing. It takes a very long time to work through the war room operations, though, on account of the mobile gaming influence decision to make the operations count down on a real human clock. By having the operations take actual human time to complete, though, it encourages players to take breaks and wait for their advisors to finish up what they're doing. By giving the player an incentive to play in shorter spurts than they might otherwise, the overwhelming banality of side questing is less noticeable. Trying to knock out huge swaths of Inquisition in a long sitting, like I've been doing to play catch-up with the rest of the world since I got the game for Christmas from my girlfriend, brings the homogeneous meaninglessness of the side questing into sharper focus. In shorter bursts, the game's beautiful visual design and stellar character writing has a greater opportunity to shine before being overwhelmed by the Inquisitor's insatiable lust for Elfroot. And you'll be more likely to come into contact with the game's main plot, which is vibrant and richly realized in ways that actually finally do surpass the previous two games, and Skyrim, and certainly the Old Republic. One of Inquisition's most remarkable strengths is how it draws from the incredibly vast amount of lore the previous two games, the Clutch of Dragon Age novels, have provided. I've noted previously that one of the key reasons that Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights came across with so much depth is because Forgotten Realms, the D&D campaign setting they're based in, is a product not just of the campaign manual, but also a tremendous amount of world building from authors like R.A. Salvatore, Mont Cook, and Ed Greenwood. Inquisition is going to introduce a lot of new players to Dragon Age, but the game is most rewarding if you've been following the series from the start, in which case the way the game builds and expands on multi-game plot threads and conflicts starts to come into focus. Dragon Age 2 serves almost no purpose other than as an extended prologue for Inquisition, but with that prologue, the game becomes epic in scope in a way that even Mass Effect doesn't quite match. Mass Effect was always conceived of as a trilogy. Each Dragon Age game is much more distinct from one another, less predictable, more experimental. I'm surprised how much is drawn not just from Dragon Age 2, but from its DLCs, Legacy in particular. Legacy was my favorite part of Dragon Age 2. It was a long dungeon crawl in the spirit of older BioWare titles, and you wake Corypheus from his ancient slumber at the end. I remember thinking, this is probably the villain for the next game, and when I was right, I was delighted at first and disappointed in the end. Corypheus in Inquisition simply is not as interesting as he was in Legacy, not in the writing and not in the boss fight itself. Dragon Age 2 also went out of its way to introduce players to Orlesian culture ahead of its time with the Mark of the Assassin DLC, as well as the entire game taking place in a story that's told in retrospect right before the beginning of Inquisition. So, when the player begins Inquisition, they're beginning in a world already shaped by hundreds of hours of player choice and player memory. A lot of the frivolous, low-impact side questing you do is slightly redeemed by this depth of background content. Sure, you might not be doing interesting and complicated quests, but they are fleshed out and given dimension by interesting and complicated quests that came before. Actual story missions, whether for your side characters or the primary plot, are also of incredible quality. Inquisition begins in a Thedas of tremendous instability, and your Inquisitor and his circle of advisors and companions will be the ones to bring that stability back, in whatever way you choose, to solve the seemingly infinite problems of Ferelden and Orlais. Dragon Age Inquisition begins with darkness and confusion, as your newly created character is pursued through the Fade by bizarre creatures only to be propelled back into reality by what sure looks like Andraste, the absentee Maker's Chosen, the central figure of the Chant of Light. When you emerge, there are demons and a hole in the sky. So immediately you have two dilemmas. A practical one, since it seems like the boundaries between the world of spirits and dreams and the real world are failing, and that's a raw deal for everybody. And a metaphysical dilemma. Are you sent by the Maker itself to solve this problem? Are you proof that the god who abandoned his works does care, after all? After what happened with your dramatic appearance from the Fade and your mysterious ability to close the Fade rifts, that's what the peoples of Thedas will think. Inquisition doesn't call upon you just to be a leader, it demands you respond to the accusation of being a prophet as well, the Herald of Andraste. Continually, all of the myths on which the world of Thedas are based are shown to be plausible. Ever since Origins, one of the most distinctive and interesting aspects of Dragon Age is the way it directly tackles issues of religion and mythology, showing how myths can grow from either truths or a misunderstanding of truths, without really ever definitively qualifying one way or another about it. The Ashes of Andraste from Origins had true flowers of healing, for example. But was that because Andraste was the Maker's Chosen, or that the mountains had unusual concentrations of lyrium? The elements of reasonable skepticism, within a world that demonstrably contains actual magic, of course, that Dragon Age offers alongside the metaphysical explanations lets the game handle issues of faith in a way that's tangible to the player in a really heavy way. The game tells you, this is what people are calling you, this is the conclusion that they've reached. You're the true Herald of Andraste. Will you embrace that? I had such a keenly felt experience with issues of faith in this game, and it left a deep impression. For the bulk of the game, I would tell people I just didn't know one way or the other about being the Herald. I hadn't made up my mind about it, and I thought it would be diplomatic to admit as much. But as the game progressed, I kept finding that I was adding chantry elements to Skyhold, because I felt like that was what the common folk wanted. And then, when it came time to choose a specialization, I figured that, if I'm going to be fighting an ancient Devinder Magister, it would be useful to be able to fight magic. So my character became a Templar. By the end of the game, I realized what Varric had been telling me. It truly did not matter what I believed about it. Events had guided my character to be the hero the people asked him to be. He was the Herald of Andraste, whether he liked it or not, and when Corypheus asked him how he really felt about it, one final time at the climax, my Inquisitor bellowed that he was the Maker's Chosen. It felt right. Perhaps the Maker had indeed abandoned the world, but the Maker helps those who help themselves, and I would not deny my character's place in things. It was a really uncommon experience as a player to have seen these dilemmas of faith shown so keenly, alongside companions who also have to struggle with the existential consequences of losing faith in the chant. It's an element that this game handles even better than previous titles, though it would not be as impressive an element if it wasn't for the complex experience of religion that each title has. I'm excited, next time, to see what it's like to play through as a hardline skeptic. So at the end of Dragon Age 2, the circles of mages were disbanded, and the mages, most of them, rebelled against the Templars. The Divine, the Lady Pope of Andrastrianism, was apparently killed when the breach between Thedas and the Fade appeared. All of the traditional power structures that have defined the culture of Thedas in the world of Dragon Age in the previous two games are fragmented and broken, waiting for their chance to fill the power vacuum or else ride there on someone else's coattails. In the beginning, no one will respect the Inquisition. They're too focused on pursuit of their own goals and have nothing but disdain for upstarts taking what's rightfully theirs. In this first act of the game has a heavy focus on how outmatched the Inquisition is, and while you work to build your stronghold in Haven, the scope of the game seems impressive but manageable. This early part of the game is paced the best, too, with so many amazing things to introduce, from characters to regions to how your Inquisition will function as an organization. Everyone says, including BioWare, don't forget to get out of the hinterlands, and in this first act, that means something. If you let the game distract you as distractions pop up, your first 25 hours really are just flat-out incredible throughout. But the actual plot develops with a great slowness, relying on just a handful of big-deal quests to advance. Once you've founded the Inquisition, you help either the Templars or the Mages, both under the thumb of the game's true villain at this point unrevealed. These story missions are mutually exclusive, but incredibly large and really interesting. Once you've completed them, whichever group you've chosen will help seal the breach and the others will be left to their fate, and then the actual bulk of the game can begin. The Inquisition can't do something so bold as seal the breach without expecting some kind of major pushback, though, and it comes, in spades. In one of the most epic single story moments in the whole BioWare catalog, the Inquisition is almost totally destroyed in one devastating assault. The ancient Magister/Darkspawn Corypheus has arrived, with an army of corrupted Templars and a pet archdemon in tow to punish your interference. It's a really memorable scene, from the feeling of complete loss and disaster to the phenomenal use of visual effects like the Avalanche and the sudden broadening of scope the game undergoes at this moment. After Haven's destruction, you wander for an indeterminate amount of time through the wilderness, lost, close to death, beating forward against the snow. Then, a miracle. The Inquisition, and your Inquisitor trailing after, come upon the venerable but crumbling fortress of Skyhold, a place not only to rest and regroup, but to grow strong and fight back from. Is it fantastic coincidence, or the hand of the Maker? Either way, people see it as more proof of the Herald's divine mandate, and you are officially put in charge of the Inquisition. From here, the bulk of the game commences, the bulk of the MMO-style gameplay, that is. In terms of the story content, Inquisition is strangely bottom-heavy, putting a tremendous amount of work into setting up the world of Inquisition, and then resolving it with a memorable questing for items and collectibles, and, on a good day, letters and notes that slightly move a plot forward. The quests you'll do for your companions are great, varied and fascinating, and so are the main quests, when you get to them. Plot missions come every 10 hours or so if you're going for the upper range of recommended levels, and it's easy to forget in the interim Astrarium hunts how flip-crack smart Inquisition can be once the plot's actually fired up. The greatest example of this is the party at the Winter Palace, where there's a plot afoot to kill the Empress Selene. There have been a lot of attempts throughout gaming history to have a sequence of palace intrigue and blackmail. Inquisition is the first game to really get it right, and the player's agency in determining the outcome of the party based on their cleverness and treasure hunting skills really makes the scene stand out from the trope when it appears in movies and books. It's a truly new take on a very old scene, and I think it's one of the most classically Dragon Age parts of the whole Inquisition experience. For starters, players have been waiting for this scene ever since Leliana first described Val Royeaux in the highly stratified, lethally competitive politicking the Elysians refer to as the game back in Origins. When Mark of the Assassin introduced us to the elaborate parties and outrageous fashions of Orlesian culture, it further set the stage for the impressiveness of this scene. The realization of it is pleasingly old school. Over the course of 2 to 3 hours, you have to covertly search different wings of the palace, finding secrets and blackmail material, while trying to root out who, exactly, is trying to kill the Empress. You even get to decide whether the assassination attempt succeeds or not. Why not have one of the alternative powers vying for the throne in your pocket? The scene leverages really great traditional castle exploration with solving puzzles, overhearing secrets, and combines these gameplay elements into a satisfying whole and a meaningful intersection of your role as the Inquisitor and the morality that comes with power and purpose. You get to really decide the moral character of not just your Inquisitor, but the Inquisition itself with this mission. Plus, the lush Baroque design of the palace and all of the dancing, drinking, and whispered threats within are just impossible to resist or forget. What is peculiar is that, after the Winter Palace, the plot begins to fall apart for the endgame. Grey Wardens are almost destroyed, but the lead up to it feels really rushed, and while it certainly is exciting and epic, the loose interaction of the war table operations and the MMO-style game pacing of the plot in the open-world regions just doesn't produce the feeling of momentum that previous Dragon Age titles had. Dragon Age 2, for all of its myriad gameplay faults, felt as fast-paced and complex as a season of a television show. Inquisition's reliance on exclamation point NPCs to advance meaningful content makes it feel like a movie that you slowly unlock tiny slivers of in reward for goofing around and hitting things with your sword. And trying to accommodate for players completing content in a free-form order, a traditional storytelling pace was sacrificed. What you get is a kind of cream-of-wheat experience as far as the player's time goes, creamily bland except for occasional fat lumps of real engaging content. This isn't helped by the fact that a great deal of the plot is, as in Dragon Age 2, just passing through on its way to another game. Morgan and Flemeth's plot is explored again, as is the fate of your character's son from Origins if your hero had one, but while shocking secrets are revealed, nothing is resolved. The mysterious realm behind the Alluvians is briefly explored, but remains enigmatic. Much about Inquisition remains frustratingly enigmatic in its totality. Even the nature of exactly what the magic in your Rift Closen mark is, and the specifics of the orb Corypheus carries, remains pretty much unrevealed. We'll talk in more detail about that later. What I loved about Origins, though, is that while some mysteries were left unresolved, there was a feeling of most things being satisfactorily addressed within the boundaries of that single game's plot. The DLC just adds even more answers and questions, and then answers for the new questions. Dragon Age 2 was clearly building towards 3, so unresolved threads were somewhat understandable, but Inquisition, for all of its vastness and massive time investment you make in it, is perhaps the least eventful BioWare game yet. It takes 90 hours to accomplish a 40-hour plot. A total playthrough of Origins, with Awakening and all of the DLC, also takes about 90 hours, but there is so much more going on. Although the physical dimensions of Origins and its world was infinitesimally smaller, the experience and depth of its plot was so much grander than Inquisition, which is ultimately as straightforward and short as just the main campaign of Origins. The execution of the plot in Inquisition is nuanced and gorgeous, from the blocking of the scenes to the use of tiny visual flourishes to enhance the feel and impact of a scene, and of course the characters. This is possibly the best ensemble cast that BioWare's come up with yet, and another one of the few ways that this game actually surpasses Baldur's Gate 2 and the Forgotten Realms RPGs. Tabletop gaming is about two things: your friends and your imagination. BioWare's RPGs are held in such high regard because of their success at using video games to provide that experience on demand by yourself. The adventuring party that has been at the core of BioWare's RPGs since Baldur's Gate has come a long way since then. In respects to character writing, Inquisition is top-notch. Each character is present in the Inquisition to offer a balance of perspectives, an individual take on the larger problems that plague Thetis, and they all feel so genuine that their input becomes genuinely meaningful. You are well and truly advised by your advisors, and that's an achievement. Plus, the game's position as the third in what will obviously be in an ongoing series of massive RPGs allows longtime franchise favorites to develop in interesting and amazing ways. None more so than Leliana's arc. Leliana was the only character in Origins to get her own DLC, which explored the events that brought her to her conversion to Endostrianism. She was an Orlesian bard, tasked to steal, humiliate, and murder in the name of the Orlesian game. Then, she was betrayed by her mentor and lover Marjolaine, and having nowhere to turn, went to the Chantry. There she came to truly believe, and that's the way she is when the hero of Ferelden meets her in that lothering tavern back in Origins. There, Leliana is so optimistic and bright, but Leliana's song, her DLC, shows her darker side. She was the divine spy master throughout the events of Dragon Age 2, making brief appearances on behalf of the Chantry. In Inquisition, the death of the divine prompts a tremendous crisis of faith for Leliana. She loses her faith in anything but tangible, demonstrable power. The Leliana we met in Leliana's song slowly creeps back into her personality over the course of the game. If you side with the mages over the Templars, you experience a vision of the future where a gaunt, tortured Leliana sacrifices herself so the Inquisitor can get away. But there's no real nobility left in her, just pragmatism and burning resentment. This possible future Leliana is really pretty depressing, and the absolute coldness of her as opposed to the warmth longtime fans remember her for. As Inquisition goes on, she begins more and more to resemble this possible future Leliana. She is one of the few characters who will actually tell you no when you ask them to be merciful. There's no talking her out of it over the course of the campaign either. This is how Leliana is now, the arc her character is moving in. And it's actually amazing to watch. Your former Templar advisor, Cullen, is also a familiar face from Origins, though you might not immediately place him. He was the imprisoned Templar right before the boss fight at the top of the Circle Tower. He also appeared in Dragon Age 2 briefly under Knight Commander Meredith. It's pretty cool to have a minor background character rise to prominence this way. It highlights the nature of the Inquisition as a group of miscellaneous cast-offs united in an understandable purpose in an uncertain world. Cullen's very charismatic and relatable to boot. He feels very real and in such a casual way that it seems perfectly reasonable that he's been living in the world this whole time, never having his moment to shine until just now. Josephine, your diplomatic advisor, is a new face, but she fits right in. She has a genuine talent and enthusiasm for her job and for the disparate cultures of Orlais and Ferelden. Frequently, she'll have some of the better suggestions for war table operations. She also has her own fascinating private struggle trying to restore her family's name to the ranks of Orlesian nobility. You can do that Josephine's way, a complex web of favors and power plays, or you can bring in Liliana for help, who uses bloodshed to get to the heart of the matter much faster. It's neat role-playing for the Inquisitor, and one of the more memorable companion quests. Together, the advisors provide a really meaningful spectrum of responses, roughly corresponding to the top, middle, and bottom choices of the dialogue wheel, but encouraging players to be more selective and open-minded about choosing expedient solutions. Skyhold, especially once you've upgraded and customized it, really does feel like the lofty seat of a powerful new force in Thedas, in no small part on account of the advisors. BioWare has been trying to get strongholds right since Baldur's Gate 2, and they tried a couple times a decade. Baldur's Gate 2 had several different strongholds depending on your class, but they were pretty static outside of a few great decision-making quests. Neverwinter Nights 2 expanded on this concept and introduced finding and hiring employees like merchants and miners alongside finding crafting materials to the mix. For a long time, Neverwinter Nights 2 was the best implementation of the stronghold idea, even with a stronghold in Dragon Age Awakening. Awakenings was great, robust, full of charm, but the expansion was comparatively short and it never felt like a real home. Skyhold is different. It's incredibly customizable and can reflect a wide range of moods and aesthetic attitudes. And it allows you to sit in judgment of sub-villains that you encounter over the course of the game. Weirdly, due to the glib MMO presentation of so many of these quests, this judgment feels like your first time even getting to know these characters at all, but Inquisition affords you a wide variety of interesting judgments for them, from cruel to merciful to ironic. The judgments in Skyhold really seal the deal on making the player feel like they really are the head honcho of the Inquisition, and that their leadership and direction matter. A cool sensation, to be sure. But you don't take Skyhold with you when you go out into the world, you take your companions, and they too provide a fantastic balance of perspectives. Dragon Age 2 began and ended with Cassandra and Varric, so sure enough, they're your first companions here in Inquisition alongside the enigmatic elven mage Solus. Varric serves a similar role in Inquisition as he did in the second game, bringing the hero down to earth, making sure he's included in the drinking and storytelling going on when the adventuring winds down for a minute. As things continue to get serious for the Inquisition, Varric becomes more and more humbled by it. These things are more serious and grander in scope than what happened in Kirkwall, and Varric feels, for lack of a better term, dwarfed by it. But the camaraderie of the group keeps him grounded. His arc's climax is simply a game of cards with a whole supporting cast, but the whole thing is handled so well. It's the first time I've ever seen a player character be given the opportunity to tell a story as well as Varric. I felt like I was bonding with my own Inquisitor as much as I was with the companion characters during the card scene, and it stuck with me a lot. Cassandra seems like she would be a straightforward addition to the cast, but they wrote her in a delightfully complex way. On the surface, she seems lost in the politicking. Closing the breach makes sense. Why should it be so hard to persuade people? Cassandra is, in many ways, a little naive, which pairs in an unexpectedly endearing way with her bravery and kindness. Rather than be a spoiled noble, she joined the Seekers, a shadowy and ancient branch of the Templars who turn out to be the vestiges of the First Inquisition. Cassandra is one of the most genuinely, heartbreakingly earnest characters they ever put in a BioWare game, and the scene where you realize that she reads Varric's trashy romance fiction on the sly is one of the most hilarious moments in Inquisition. Cassandra ended up being my Inquisitor's romantic choice, and I was stoked to see that romances in Inquisition are way more believable than they ever used to be. When you select an option to flirt, you just flirt. It's not a switch that suddenly shifts your train over onto the romance rails. Eventually, the character decides what they want to do about the flirting. It's effortlessly natural and well integrated into the plot. It's such a huge improvement over Origins, too, and it's even a big improvement over Dragon Age 2, which had perhaps an overemphasis on character romance. Here, romance fits easily into the background as a subplot, and a genuinely fun subplot as well. I YouTubed a couple of the other romances, and they all seem to have a much more natural, grounded feel to them. Importantly, Cassandra is a fantastic, compelling, and well-developed character regardless of whether a romance is involved, which is fundamentally the thing people who ask for better women characters in games are asking for. Solus is a much more enigmatic addition to the cast, and judging by the events of the climax, one of the most important to upcoming Dragon Age content. But it somewhat cheapens the experience of Solus here in Inquisition. You get to know him pretty well, his nature and his beliefs, but there's no real arc because they're saving all of his development for later, after the twist. He's interesting, and it's good to have the perspective of a historically minded mage while you're adventuring. You'll learn a lot from Solus and his ambient dialogue. He's likable, but all you can really expect from him as a character is that the two of you will become acquainted. It doesn't even add that much to the experience of the Dalish, who appear very passingly in this game and make a small impression. Solus isn't even part of the Dalish, anyway. He's something much older that only gets revealed after the end of the game, which is fine, but it leaves Solus as a character and the Dalish as a group relatively unexplored for this game. City elves and alienages are another theme from previous games that gets glossed over in this one, though for a clearer reason. There is no city in Inquisition, not like previous games. Sure, there's Val Royeaux, but beyond its brief introduction, it's little more than a shopping concourse for the rest of the game. So much emphasis is put on wilderness areas and on Skyhold that urban areas are pretty much completely absent from Inquisition. You get a little bit of Redcliffe Village, but not the Keep, and it feels somehow much smaller than it was in Origins. So the city elf you get, Sarah, has an arc that focuses much more on the common folk of the Inquisition than on alienage-specific issues. Sarah's a great character besides, a born contrarian, and she fits into the Inquisition in interesting ways. She continually subverts and humiliates those with power, and those who get too full of themselves, so if the Inquisitor wants to be friends with Sarah, they can't take their station wholly seriously. She constantly advocates for the little folks, the cooks and blacksmiths and common soldiers who comprise the Inquisition beyond the inner circle. It's a really important group to have a companion advocate for, and her vocal support for them and caustic insults when she sees the powerless be treated as such makes the organization of the Inquisition feel more real. How the Inquisitor treats the hourly wage folks in the Inquisition is just as important a decision as the throne room judgments. The Qunari are barely present in the plot either, at least not in my playthrough. Besides allowing the Inquisitor to be a Qunari and Iron Bowl's short but enjoyable subplot, this mysterious and remote race of peoples stays mysterious and remote. Iron Bowl's plot is mostly about whether the values of Ferelden and Orlais, the values that tell him that the lives of his mercenary band is more important than the mission, will come into conflict with the values of his position as a member of the Ben Hassrath, which tells him that he must play his part regardless of feelings. I enjoyed Iron Bowl a lot, but he's not Sten. He's got some of the most winning voice acting, enjoyable characterization in the game, but his value as an advocate for his culture is kinda minimal. His presence in the game and the plot is pretty small also in the grand scheme of the game. The Grey Wardens are in the game quite a bit, on the other hand, but never quite in the way that you want them to be. Blackwall is your Warden companion, and while the item collection quest he sends you on takes you to many impressive Grey Warden ruins, none of those ruins really add to your understanding of the Grey Wardens. You go to these places to gather items and to get points that indicate that Blackwall likes you more, not to learn stuff. That's not Blackwall's fault, of course. He's a great personality based partially, it seems, off of Nick Offerman, if the beard, compassionate masculinity, and woodworking are any indication. Blackwall has a fantastic twist that plays out in a meaningful way, but his arc seems to kinda end abruptly after that. I felt like I never really got to tie things up properly with Blackwall. He's a great addition, especially in the early game, but he fizzles out, and the Wardens kinda fizzle out as late-game plot items. Anyway, while the Grey Wardens may make an appearance, the hero of Ferelden, your character from Origins, does not. But Hawk, your character from Dragon Age 2, does show up and fights alongside you for a time. This is the first time I've ever seen a PC being used as an NPC in a sequel, and it's really fun. When you set up your world state with Dragon Age Keep, you choose what sort of overall attitude Hawk has, and then Hawk acts that way to the Inquisitor when he shows up in the game. And you get to do a custom Inquisition version of Hawk's face, so it's exactly how you want it to be. Hawk even has a chance to die in Inquisition if you let him, or her. While Hawk isn't a companion character, I was incredibly stoked to see him be part of the greater supporting cast, and it's handled in a really fun and new kind of way. Your companion Cole isn't a returning character, but he's a riff on another BioWare character, Thane from Mass Effect 2. Cole is a spirit of compassion trapped in the body of a young man who died under terrible conditions. Dragon Age Awakening already sort of touched on the idea of spirits as companions with Justice, but Cole the Compassion Spirit feels much more gimmicky than Justice ever did. Where Thane in Mass Effect 2 had perfect recall, Thane would have these intense little monologues about his memory. Cole does almost the exact same thing, with almost the exact same intonations and pacing as Thane, when he looks inside the minds of people who are hurting. Because he's a spirit, he understands very incompletely how to actually treat living beings with compassion that doesn't kill them or alter them, which is really interesting. But Cole feels like someone said, you know, people really love that Evan Peters guy on American Horror Story. Can we, put him in the game somehow? Not him, but, kinda, you know. And then someone follows up that suggestion with, yeah, and make sure he's super duper intense and stuff. Mission accomplished, I guess. Vivienne is another character that people don't seem to care for that much, but on account of the fact that she's incredibly self-centered and condescending, which she is, and I love it. She's an Orlesian power player, and she lives and breathes the Orlesian game. She's important to the party composition. She's hard to like, but she's phenomenally competent and exceptionally stylish. Vivienne is her own woman, unromanceable, aloof, with plenty of political clout to rival or mirror the Inquisitor's own. She has one of the least interesting sets of personal side quests. They bring up more questions about Vivienne than they answer, but she's a great anchor for a needed bit of realpolitik within the Inquisition. Your last mage, Dorian, is a renegade mage from Tevinter. Dorian's subplot is all about his orientation as a gay mage in a deeply conservative society. Tevinter, where he comes from, is all about appearances, and Dorian's failure to fit in that regard makes him a bit of a scandal. He's alienated from his family and his home. But breaking off and following his own path has led him to a life of greater honor and integrity than he likely ever would have led in Tevinter. Dorian's got a forceful charisma, charming, clever, heartfelt. He's one of the best companions by a pretty big degree, and his subplot handles gay issues in the most compassionate, natural way I've ever seen in a game. His loyalty quest is all about reconciling with his father, or not, and to have this familiar scene of coming out and confronting a not-so-understanding parent play out with all of these fantasy themes, with mages and mage societies weaving through the background, feels grounded in both the world of Thetis and the world of the player. Inquisition really raises the bar for presentation of LGBT characters. They are characters in the world first, complex, dynamic, and their sexuality is explored as just another part of getting to know them. Of course, finally, there's Morrigan. Weirdly enough, Morrigan looks, on account of the hugely increased details of the faces in Inquisition, even younger than she did in Origins. But she shows up during adventures at the Winter Palace and joins on as an advisor on magic and the Fade, though she is, of course, pursuing her own agenda at the same time. Morrigan finally reveals some really interesting secrets about the Dragon Age universe, like what's behind the Illuvians, but the answers aren't quite as comprehensive as I wanted them to be. We're really only being led to the next step of these metaphysical puzzles instead of their solutions. Morrigan has a potentially life-changing event happen to her towards the end of the game, which Flemeth, in her Dragon Age 2 outfit, shows up to try and exploit. This is an amazing scene, and it changes in huge ways depending on some of your choices in Inquisition, but it's a scene that's only passing through. For all of its 100 hours or more of content, Inquisition is only a stop on the way to more Dragon Age. And that's a lot cheaper of an ending than I expected for such an otherwise amazing game. Initially, it seemed like Inquisition was deliberately avoiding some of the most predatory design choices of previous titles, no Day 1 DLC being foremost among them. Inquisition is supposed to be a complete, self-contained epic experience with nothing withheld for extra cost. That, I'm quite sorry to say, ended up being bullshit. What they withheld was a satisfying climax. Once you're ready to fight Corypheus, that's what you do. There is no lead-up besides the previous quest. Start the mission, and it delivers you immediately into the boss fight. It's so abrupt that it's almost confusing. I really did not have any idea why Corypheus was doing any of what he was doing in the last half hour, and then that half hour was over, with no answers. Corypheus could have been a great villain, and the game sets him up like a rival and an equal to the Inquisitor, but that parallel never really plays out. Like Arya and Oleg in the Omega DLC for Mass Effect 3, BioWare hasn't seemed to have learned that you can't effectively set up a character as a rival if that character never shows up to interact with the player. He is, in many ways, a fantastic character for the rival dynamic, but he's an absentee villain in the game and nothing more. The game's willingness to let the player take their time and the assurance it gives the player that everything in the world will wait patiently until you're ready for it saps the weight right out of Corypheus. Then, after that, you get a throne room party all at the end of the Origins campaign and a final moment with your chosen romantic interest. Then the epilogue and a free play state so you can go and do any of the quests you didn't finish, like, say, Shard Collection. There's an epilogue, but little good it does.
Ties with their leaders at
in the epilogue, Morrigan, who
and that
narrates,
a bitter
mentions that no word comes from
now
the grave
rages
fortress
between
of
them.
Weishaupt.
What becomes of Hawk is unknown.
I don't know. I do know I'll get
save that
charged
all
$14.99
news out
to
of
find out.
Weishaupt
Rather than
Soon
shaving any
ends.
content off the front end of the game
Does
for
the
DLC,
sudden
they shaved
silence
it right off the
indicate a battle
climax.
within?
Inquisition resolves
Or
itself
something
functionally. The breach is closed,
far
Proteus is good and
worse?
dead, but it resolves almost nothing that has been going on in the side content, and flatly nothing with all the Morgan Flemeth stuff brought up in the last third of the game. It just heaps on more mystery. If the game actually had been 40 hours, that could have been fine. It worked alright for Dragon Age 2. But for a 100-hour game to struggle so much with evenly distributing satisfactory story content over the whole 100 hours, to then give such a soft fart of an ending, is pretty insulting. I still love Inquisition. The game is too huge and too beautiful to hate completely, even with a major flaw like this. And it's also important to consider that BioWare DLC is almost always excellent. A real climax of the game may still be coming. Players simply have to wait a year and pay $10. I think that's so cynical, and it does detract heavily from my overall feelings about the game. It's hard, even after a video this long, even after 2 weeks of being almost completely absorbed by the world of Inquisition, to really definitively say if Inquisition was the game that I wanted. It's certainly not the game that I expected, but it has so many things going for it, from peerless environmental design to polished genre writing in the script. If the game had just been its story and its characters and its beautiful environments at about 40 to 60 hours of playtime, I would have loved it without reservations, would have considered it one of BioWare's best. But Inquisition values numbers more than the plot in true MMO style. Question is, what is the point of endlessly pursuing better inventory, more collectibles, and more XP when there's no multiplayer endgame, when you can lower the difficulty to casual and ignore the needs for maxing stats and inventory? These numbers goals are the foundation of many amazing RPGs, most notably the Diablo series. But numbers are not the reason people play Dragon Age. Inquisition gives you the game that you wanted. It does give you a game of tough choices and political intrigue. You just have to also play an equally long game about picking flowers to finish it. Fourth, but Inquisition is a modern title. It draws from modern game design more than it does anything in BioWare's back catalog. From its cinematic plot and scene direction to its compulsive, sprawling quest structures, Inquisition is relentlessly contemporary, and I can't figure out if I mean that as compliment or criticism or both. What I wanted from Inquisition, what the fans asked for, was an epic role-playing experience that was as wide open as Dragon Age 2 was closed off, with a full realization of its world and its peoples. I got that. I got 100 hours of it. I spent 20 of those hours bending over to pick up elf root. The real difficulty the designers faced with Inquisition was organization. The players want a huge world, hugest possible. They want to do things within the world in a chaotic, free-form way. For Skyrim, the solution was to reduce quest complexity and, for the most part, to eliminate quest consequence. Everything in Skyrim is about the player character, where Dragon Age is supposed to be about the whole party. The kind of the domain of Bethesda RPGs. I did my Skyrim vs. Dragon Age retrospective video just to explore that dynamic while I was waiting for Inquisition to finally arrive. After a 90-hour comprehensive playthrough of Inquisition, I have to admit that I was wrong. I wasn't wrong to be excited. Inquisition is one of the most consistently beautiful games I've ever played from a visual perspective, and its realization of the world of Dragon Age makes it come to life in ways it never really has before. What I was wrong about is how I expected it to blend open-world mechanics with BioWare storytelling. It does not borrow heavily from Skyrim. It borrows instead from the limited experience BioWare already has making open-world RPGs. Inquisition is, in its blood, a single-player MMO that owes many of its design decisions to the Old Republic, BioWare's big-ticket Star Wars MMO that never really took off. I stopped playing the Old Republic a couple months after it launched and had more or less forgotten it, mostly because of how incompletely the role-playing elements meshed with the trivial, endless grinds of the MMO elements. Inquisition improves on a lot of technically impressive than anything I've ever seen from BioWare. I remember the first time I saw grass waving in the wind in Neverwinter Nights when the first one came out, and I thought my character looked absolutely amazing, standing there in full 3D, real 3D, with grass that wasn't just painted into the texture. I felt like I was looking at a small piece of the future, a step on the way to a game where what can be displayed on the screen is as detailed as what I see in my imagination when I read the text boxes and written descriptions that all older RPGs rely on. Neverwinter Nights the First, graphically and otherwise, has aged poorly, but it's an important step between the isometric AD&D adventures of Baldur's Gate and Dragon Age. Dragon Age Origins felt like a new Neverwinter Nights, the same spirit, without the Dungeons & Dragons licensing fees. Now, with Inquisition, I think it's clear that BioWare has finally and fully moved on from the tabletop-inspired design choices of previous games. Sure, it uses the four-person party, it asks you if you would like to gather your party and venture the Old Republic's problems, but it also carries over a lot of those problems. Inquisition is a difficult game to critique because it is so many things at once, because it is perhaps the most ambitious BioWare title to date, and absolutely the most gorgeous, even where the pursuit of that ambition and beauty causes the game to fall flatly on its face. Inquisition is the biggest single-player game BioWare ever released, bigger by actual in-game miles than I ever expected it to be. Thoroughly exploring the game, knocking out all the quests you can find, can easily surpass 100 hours of gameplay. It's probably got the best content for dollars ratio out of all the games released last year. It is overwhelmingly huge, spanning 2 kingdoms and little over a dozen gigantic regions, from deserts to rain-swept coastlines to lush forests of several varieties. You control not just the destiny of you and your adventuring party, but control a sprawling political and military organization that can shift the face of the world as the game progresses. It's the world of Thetis, writ large in a way the series never has, indeed in a way that's more
Hi, I'm Noel In this video I'm going to be doing an in-depth critique of Dragon Age Inquisition, the third and by far largest of the Dragon Age titles. I'm going to be doing a really detailed look at the game, so there's going to be major spoilers. If you haven't played the game yet, take care. I ruin a lot of stuff, including the ending. But I get to talk about those things, and a lot of video reviews so far don't. So, if you don't mind the spoilers, keep going.
When I first started reading about Inquisition way before it was released, it looked like it was going to deliver the best of 2 worlds. The incredible storytelling and character building that characterize a BioWare game, and the player-driven open-world exploration that has long